Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I got a really cool show for you today. You know, the deal is we can't always catch fish off of beds while they're spawning, but I've got you 3 techniques here that's gonna help you find those spawning fish faster than just using your eyes. These 3 techniques are gonna change the way that you fish for bedding fish. In the meantime, hit that subscribe button at the bottom right hand corner and let's get right back to it. You know, one of my favorite techniques, especially for low light conditions, is a floating worm. You know, the deal is there's a bunch of floating worms out there. Strike King makes one, Zoom makes one, among a bunch of other ones, okay? And a floating worm is a colorful worm. It comes in a lot of different colors. People have their preference, I have my preference. But the deal is I'm gonna break it down exactly what you need to look for the next time you're on the water trying to catch a bass on a floating worm. You know, as you can tell here, I've got a bubblegum colored worm, a pink worm, okay? Pink is a standout color for sight fishing and for a floating worm. So I know this seems extremely basic for some, but this is gonna help you catch fish when others can't. So basically, my color selection is a wide variety. You know, I have one rigged right here, but I throw a lot of different colors for different situations, okay? And so that's what I'm gonna talk to you today about. When I'm fishing super clear water, that's when I'm gonna go to a bubblegum colored Strike King Finesse worm. This is a 7-inch worm. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna twitch that worm around, but that's only for clear water, okay? So it gets a little better and a little bit more complex, because if you know me by now, I'm gonna make things complicated. So that's what I throw for really, really clear water, you know, and I'm talking like a Lake Hartwell, Lake Lanier, places that you can see more than 3 foot is when I throw the pink worm. And I'll throw it when it's cloudy, sunny, doesn't matter what it is. All right, the other color worm I throw is methylate. Methylate is the color worm that I throw on places that have a little bit more stain, natural stain to the water. So places like Lake Fork, Sam Rayburn, Toledo Bend, Guntersville, places that have that little bit of stain but some grass, and those fish are kind of intermixed in that grass. This is the perfect technique for catching them. And this worm, this particular color, stands out like a light in the sky. It's insane how much this one stands out, and it's a really good alternative. However, this is where I'm gonna throw you a little bit of a curveball. Right here is candy crawl. That's right, this is candy crawl. It's basically a watermelon candy, okay? Now, the normal train of thought on a floating worm is I gotta throw something bright. I've gotta throw something I can see. However, there are certain situations that I will twitch around a candy crawl colored finesse worm to get those strikes. And I'll tell you when I do that. That is for very clear water lakes. And I'm talking like a Cumberland, something that is just so gin clear that a bright color is just a little bit too much, a little bit too standoutish. And this worm color right here, just a watermelon red, something that has that watermelon to green pumpkin hue, is a stone cold killer when it comes to those types of situations. So to give you kind of a breakdown, here is my floating worm box. As you can tell, it's got a bunch of bright colors in it, a lot of crazy things. I mean, from white to bubblegum to methylate. I've got big worms, I got small worms, I got them all in here. But one particular color, it's not a Strike King bait, but one particular color that I have is a 7-inch straight tail worm. I think this is called Disco Purple. It's a trick worm. It's in Disco Purple. It's more of a transparent type bait, okay? I throw this when those fish are on clear water reservoirs and we're post frontal, and I know that they're still up their garden beds. Now this is a clear type worm. You can twitch this worm around on that weightless rig and you're gonna be surprised on how many fish that you actually catch. It's a transparent worm. It's very subtle. It goes against the science behind the floating worm, but I'm guarantee you, you will catch a lot of fish on your clear water reservoirs post frontal conditions on this Disco Purple. So now I'm gonna talk to you about the hook and setup that I'm using for this floating worm. you know, it's not as basic as you would think. I try to keep it as basic as possible, but I do kind of branch out a little bit. You know, obviously I throw a bigger one from time to time, or I'll throw the smaller worm like this. My personal preference is to rig it Texas style. As you can see here, you know, the Texas style keeps it weedless. I can fish in and around cover extremely well. You know, hooks, I always had a hard time with hooks, figuring out the exact right hook to use. I've got 3 favorites, and I kind of cycle between them just depending on how I feel, and it has nothing to do with conditions or anything. I just can't make my mind up on which I like the best. I throw an Owner, it's just a regular offset shank worm hook. I think it's a 3/0. I throw a 4/0 cover shot hook by Owner, which is a straight shank hook with a little keeper at the top. Or I throw the Hayabusa 3/0 hook. This is just a normal offset hook. It has that slick coating on it. I really like that slick coating. I think it hooks them up well. Once you get past the hook, once you get past the Texas rig portion of it, you're going to see a fluorocarbon leader here. And it's about 10 to 14 inches long. I mean, it's not very big, but not too small. This is 15-pound Strike King tour grade fluorocarbon line, a tiny little swivel. This is my little drop shot swivel. I don't want something to add too much weight, but just the only reason I put a swivel in there is to reduce line twist. So the bad thing about a floating worm, and the good thing about it, is when you twitch it, it darts everywhere. Twists, turns, goes every direction, as you can see. But the problem is, if you do that on a spinning rod, you're going to get an immense amount of line twist, okay? So what I do is I put it on 10-pound Strike King Tour Grade braid, yellow. And the yellow braid is such a key because you can watch the fish eat the bait by just watching your line sometimes. Now, granted, I like to twitch the bait up to where I can see the bait the whole time, but sometimes you're going to see that line jump before you see your bait disappear. And I know that sounds crazy, but it is an absolute fact. So that's one trick that I like to use there. So on the rod, though, I use a 7-foot medium action Pro TI rod. I like the Pro TI because it's extremely sensitive, and I want a very sensitive rod, strong rod for this technique to get that hook set perfectly. A Team Loose Custom Pro 3000. I like the 3000 size spinning reel. It gives you the least amount of line twist, and I think that's extremely important. I don't care if you're throwing braid, fluorocarbon, whatever. This 3000 size Custom Pro gets it done. So we've talked about line, we've talked about how you rig it up, we've talked about colors. Now let's fish it a little bit, and I'm gonna twitch it around and show you exactly what you're supposed to do. So basically, what you do is you cast this thing out there, and try not to cast it in a tree like that. And all you're doing is you're reeling and twitching, okay? And you keep it about as basic as possible. You reel, twitch, reel, twitch, reel, twitch. And you're keeping that thing right under the surface. And that's what makes that bright colored worm so important, is because you can see that worm from a very long ways off. It's not necessarily about the fish seeing it as much as it is you seeing it. And that's the whole key to it. Now granted, what I told you before, using those more transparent worms, green pumpkin worms, those are for clear water situations when I can see a green pumpkin worm 6 foot down if I need to. And I'm talking super gin clear water, but the deal is some people have that wherever they're fishing. So that's one key to it, is keeping a visual on that worm. Now, I'm going to tell you one thing that I know a couple of my buddies like to do. One in particular, Jacob Wheeler, he likes to wacky rig his floating worm and twitching on top and keeping it moving. And I think that's fine. I have more of a problem hanging it up doing it that way. So I tend to Texas rig it a lot more. But wacky rigging it is an option. You fish it the exact same way. I've basically fished it on the exact same setup. But that's how I fish my floating worm. Up next, you're going to see another great technique that's going to help you catch more bass too. Hey guys, for my second technique for fish that I can't physically see but I know are spawning, is throwing a swim bait. Throwing a swim bait sounds super simple, and like a bunch of guys do it a bunch of different ways. I personally have a couple ways that I like to fish it more than anything. The first swim bait I'm going to talk to you about is a little modified line through swim bait that I make out of a 4.75 inch Rage swimmer. So this 4.75 inch rated swimmer is in the color IU. This is the color I reach for almost 95 to 99% of the time. And the reason I like it, it has that real natural green back, that watermelon type back, and more of like a translucent white bottom. But you know what? We don't stop there. I'm gonna do a couple modifications to this swim bait to make it better for where you're fishing. So the first thing is that you do, before you do anything, you gotta get this little threading tool that puts this this sleeve into the head of the swim bait. I dropped it in the description below so you can see exactly what I'm putting in there. But anyways, you push this thing in there at an angle and you make your swim bait a line through swim bait. This one right here is an 1/8 ounce. And at the business end of this, I actually have a size 2 Gamkatsu round bend and just a nice size split ring. I always put a split ring on there, mainly because it allows that hook to hang freely, even if you're keeping the line tight. So the hook, you can kind of free swing around even when the line's tight like that. So basically all you do is you hook that thing in there to where the hook is laying just like this. This allows the swim bait to track naturally through the water. All right, so we have the swim bait built. There's 2 modifications that I make to the swim bait to make it look more appealing to bass. And it's super simple and it sounds easier than what it is, but I'm telling you, it makes a world of difference. So the first thing I do is I get an orange dye marker pen, okay? And what I do is I take this pen and I'm gonna color the throat of this swim bait orange, from the tip all the way to where the line through threading tool comes out. I'm gonna color that entire thing solid orange, just like that, okay? That's the first thing that I do. The second thing that I do is I get some chartreuse dipping dye and I dye the tail. But I don't dye the whole tail, I just dye the tip of the tail. Just like so. Just a little bit off the tip of the tail. When this thing swims through the water, it looks like a bluegill that's ready to raid the nest. So, what I do with this swim bait. So this isn't a swim bait that I throw everywhere. This is a swim bait that I like to throw in very particular places. I like throwing this in more scattered open water situations, a spawning flat, something that doesn't have a lot of hang-ups, or if I'm burning down the bank on a rocky reservoir and I want my hookup ratio to be spectacular. And that's what that line through swim bait does. The reason I picked this type of swim bait for a line through technique is because the hookup ratio is fantastic. The swim bait has that perfect pulsing action through the water. The technique is very simple. You literally throw that swim bait out there and you try to keep your rod tip high and you reel it right underneath the surface. Not every fish that comes up there and boils on it is going to eat the swim bait. And that's the perfect thing about this. It's not about catching the fish every time that you see them come up on this bait. 9 times out of 10, when you're rolling that swim bait across the top of the water, those fish are gonna come up and look at it and swim back down to their bed, and that's when you can go over there and catch them off of the bed. So this is a perfect little technique for covering water, trying to find bedfish without physically having to look for them. It makes the process 10 times faster. So that's the first swim bait technique that I have. This is what I use. I actually like this technique about 70% of the time. I love that open hook because if you have one that comes in swirls on it, a lot of times you're still gonna catch that fish, and the hookup ratio, like I said, is just fantastic. I use it on a Magnum hammer, 15-pound Strike King Tour grade fluorocarbon, and a 7.5 to 1 gear ratio reel. I don't like going over 15. 15's that perfect diameter to make that swim bait float high and have the right action. You can go higher. I've gone up to as big as 20. But that 17 or 15 gets the job done. The second swim bait I like to do is a weedless swim bait. Now, this one is a little bit different. I use this in more techniques where I'm having to skip this thing around docks, around really heavy vegetation or bushes. This particular swim bait is not a Strike King swim bait. It's a swim bait that's made by a company called, what is that? Lunker Hunt. As a buddy of mine makes this swim bait, designed this swim bait, Matt Arey. He's one of our Lose guys, and it's called the Fetch, and it's just about a 5-inch swim bait. I use a 7/0. Now I know this goes against what he likes to use, but I use a 7/0 VMC. I think he uses a 6/0 Gamkatsu, but I use a 7/0 VMC and I use 30-pound braid. The 30-pound braid gets the hookup ratio just a little bit better. The cool thing about this swim bait is I can use it on the exact same gear that I throw my swim jig on, which is a 7.3 hair jig rod. It's a Ledge series rod, 30-pound braid, 7.5 to 1 gear ratio reel. I can skip this thing around all kinds of cover. And I'm telling you, I can skip it around docks, you can skip it around anything and swim that thing right under the surface. It has the right balance of plastic to where this thing almost is a wake bait. And so you're gonna see those fish roll up there on it and come look at it, or in some cases eat it. And I think that's what makes this swim bait so unique. Now, that's not the only one I throw whenever it's a weedless situation. I actually have a handful that I go through, that I rotate through, that I think are just as good of options, okay? So, one particular option is made by another really good friend of mine, Fred Rumbanis. This is the Baby Boom Boom swim bait. It's about 4 inches long. The owner actually makes a hook that's perfect for this thing. This is one that I'm going to use like a 6/0, actually like a 4 to 6/0 owner beast hook. It's a weighted hook. This thing swims out of this world. I use this on more clear water reservoirs, around bushes or standing cover that I can't get a line through swim bait around. However, the other option that I have for a weedless swim bait kind of runs in line with the line through rage swimmer. That is using a belly blade. A belly blade is a weighted hook, a weighted hook with a little hitchhiker on the front that has a blade on it. So typically you'd think, oh, I'm gonna throw a shad color, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. But that's where I make the little curveball adjustment, just like I do on my line through. And I actually turn to green pumpkin. Solid green pumpkin rage swimmer, 3.75 inches long. I do the exact same dyeing setup to where I put the orange throat and then I do a chartreuse tail. For whatever reason, the spring is the #1 time of year to throw a bluegill colored swim bait. I'm a big proponent to bluegill colored swim baits. I think you catch a ton of fish on bluegill colored swim baits, especially this time of year. I've caught some of the biggest fish this time of year throwing those bluegill colored swim baits. But hey, we have one more technique to go. Stay tuned for right after this. You know, for my third technique is one that I'm very passionate about and I catch a lot of really big fish on, especially around the spawn, and that's throwing a Pipsqueak popping perch. And not just the Pipsqueak, I throw the regular popping perch as well. But you know, I throw this thing around all types of cover. You know, I'm skipping this way back in willow trees, fishing it around hay grass, fishing it around bushes, bank grass, whatever the situation may be. Those fish are up there spawning, eating perch, guarding fry, whatever they're doing, they will eat that popping perch. So it actually took me a minute to get on board with the popping perch, mainly because the tail was kind of silly looking. But if you think about it from a standpoint of a fish looking up at this bait, it actually has the profile of a perch. The way that it's built and everything like that, it actually looks very realistic in the water. And I'm gonna tell you why you throw this popping perch. So the popping perch, you can, like I said, you can skip it around everything. It makes that popping action when you're working it. I particularly like to fish this thing fairly quickly, but in this time of year, I slow this thing way down. I wanna keep that thing in that motion, but I don't want it to fish too fast over those fish. So if you're fishing around a lot of male fish, you know, that are garden beds, stuff like that, you can fish it fast and they'll eat it. No question. But if you want to catch the really big female, that's when I slow it way down. So in one of my previous videos, I said that you need to scale your bait size to the type of fish that you're fishing for, whether it's, you know, the biggest fish in the lake's a 5-pounder to the biggest fish in the lake's a 15-pounder. And that's how I pick my size of bait. So if I'm on a lake that doesn't have just a ton of very big fish, and it's more of that 2 to 4 pound range fish and the occasional 5 or 6 pounder, that's actually when I go with the Pipsqueak popping perch. It's a little bit smaller profile, still it's a very soft frog. I can skip this thing around. I still use the same setup. I actually use the setup that I use all the time on the same frog, like an open water frog, and that's the Ledge jig worm rod. This is a Mark Rose rod, 50-pound Strike King tour grade braid, green in color. And man, I just keep it basic. I can skip this thing everywhere around, make cast, roll cast around with it, and just kind of walk it around. And that's what makes this frog so good, is you can fish this thing very quickly and cover water. So we've talked about the Finesse version of this. That's when I actually turn to the regular popping perch for when I'm on a lake that has big fish. And that's like a Rayburn, a Gunnersville, Toledo Bend, something that has really big fish. Toho, Gunnersville, they love this thing. This big popping perch, it just looks very realistic to them. We have some extremely realistic colors, like our regular bluegill. Like we have a living image bluegill that just looks fantastic. But we also have your more loud colors. I personally, around the spawn, like the louder colors. I think for whatever reason, maybe the fish can see them from further away. I can see them better. I don't know what it is. It's just the fact that these really loud colors work extremely well during the spawn. So, you know, we talked about quite a few different baits. So we talked about throwing the floating worm and why you use certain colors, the loud to all the way to the subtle colors, the swim baits from line throughs to the weedless ones. And now we've talked about throwing that popping perch and skipping it around cover. You know what? I hope this segment of looking for fish without visually seeing them during the spawn is going to help you catch more bass this spring. I know I'm going to have fun catching them. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner if you haven't already. Got another great video coming next week, guys. I appreciate you watching. Thanks for tuning in.